Live from New York, it's Saturday night!
And the Masters of the Universe. I am Adam, Prince of Eternia, defender of the secrets of Castle Grayskull. This is Cringer, my fearless friend. Fabulous secret powers were revealed to me the day I held aloft my magic sword and said, "By the power of Grayskull!" Cringer became the mighty Battle Cat, and I became He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe. Only 3 others share this secret. Our friends, the Sorceress, Man-at-Arms, and Orko. Together, we defend Castle Grayskull from the evil forces of Skeletor.
Hello and welcome to Cambridge and Washawn, the show about 2 guys' obsessions, passions, and hobbies. We're still back in our childhood obsessions, and on this episode, we are only talking about 1 item apiece. So we're slowly whittling things down here. We did 3 the first time, 2 last time, and we're only doing 1 this time because these are pretty big deals for the both of us.
If we keep going this way, next time we won't be talking about anything.
We won't talk about anything next time. I'm sure people would love that. It'll be a really short show. So yours is something that has continued or restarted, and mine is one that didn't stick with me. We'll get into all that. But this came up for me on the first episode. I said something, mentioned something, and I'm like, oh yeah, I got to talk about that. And then since then, finding all these threads and connections, I was like, this is a long discussion for me. So that's why I asked you to pick one that you could talk about for a while. So before we get into any of that, do you have any corrections or addendums or clarifications from the first 2 episodes?
Nope, not last time. Yes. I noticed that I used the word weird like 20,000 times in that episode.
Oh, how funny.
I'm going to try to not use the word weird as much today, though it's definitely going to happen.
That happens a lot when I'm editing Wake Up Heavy, especially back in the old days. I'm like, boy, you sure did get stuck on that word, Mark.
Yeah, I was like, wow, that's like, okay, it's been 2 minutes. I've said it 20 times.
I didn't even notice that. Okay, I do have some corrections and et ceteras. This goes back to the first episode. We were talking about the Alan Ormsby book and that Jekyll and Hyde makeup trick, and I mentioned that there was a movie that used it really effectively, and I see the clip for it every couple of months. And I said, it's called something like The Octopus, and it was a foreign film, so I was partly right. It's called The Octopus. It's from 1937, and it's an American film.
Oh.
And it's described as a comedy mystery thriller. And the description on IMDb actually sounded really interesting, so I'm going to try and track it down and watch it at some point. This was on the second episode when we were talking about things that we had gotten recently that tied into the past, and I was like, I think I have something else, but I couldn't remember what it was. And it was the retro C-3PO 3 3/4 figure from the Droids series. They reissued C-3PO, R2-D2, and Boba Fett on those cards. Droids is something that was like out of my purview back then. I knew nothing about the Droids show, never watched it. It's on Disney Plus for anyone that's interested. Cleo and I watched the first episode. It's kind of interesting. It's a very 80s. Everybody has mohawks and stuff.
Yeah. I got a real kick out of it. And actually, when I rewatched it, because I found it on Disney Plus too, I rewatched it, I was like, the thing that I hated about the Boba Fett miniseries on Disney Plus, the recent one, were those motorcycle kids, the cyborg motorcycle kids. I was like, oh crap, that's like straight out of Droids. And so then I was like, all right, I can kind of accept it a little bit more now. It's a distinct nod to that super 80s cyberpunk stuff happening in Droids. So yeah, for sure.
I vaguely remember hearing that because I saw the complaints.
Oh yeah.
And I thought it was pretty funny. I'm like, oh, we've got mods now with all the...
Yeah.
I just thought of Quadrophenia.
Oh, for sure.
But that makes a lot of sense.
I have a question for you. Where'd you find the C-3PO from the Droids?
It's on Amazon. They had it, I think it was like $10 or something.
So it's the new version.
Yeah, it's the new version.
Okay, cool.
It's a retro reproduction.
Nice.
Comes with the little
coin. Yeah.
And
love that.
The R2-D2 listing was really sketchy on there. It made it sound like you might or might not get it on a card. You might just get a loose figure, so I didn't do that. And the Boba Fett I don't think was available. I'm sure that's all sold out.
Of course, right. I did find the Black Series version of the Boba Fett in the color scheme of the Droids design. And it comes with like a Droids packaging and stuff like that. It's pretty cool.
So also from last episode, when I was talking about the wall and Bob Geldof's hair, I forgot to mention I was also really obsessed with his sunglasses in that movie.
Oh, yeah.
I bring that up today because it's going to play a part in the thing I'm going to talk about on this episode in regard to sunglasses. He had those kind of round tortoiseshell sunglasses, and I swear to God, I looked for those. Everywhere that had sunglasses, I looked for something like that and never found anything like it. And then the last thing, I brought up your talent in multi-disciplines, and I kind of brought it up for a reason because I don't think we've mentioned this. We play out most of the episodes, except for this one, with your old music for IG-88.
Yeah.
You mentioned the writing and the art, and my point was going to be that the player image is a detail from one of your recent paintings.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll be using, and I have some at home that I can use as well.
Oh, yeah.
Details from Ronnie's art are going to be the player images until further notice. So the player art and if you go to Spreaker, it's the, whatever the heck they call that up on top.
That is called a cover image, Mark.
Of the page is another detail from another painting that were just in the show you had last week.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I think it turned out to be pretty good.
And the previous show you had.
Oh, yeah.
Will segue into what you're going to talk about today. So you've had 2 shows in the last 2 months.
That I know, and I'm exhausted, to be honest with you.
So that's all of the corrections I have.
Oh, you know what? I did think about a correction. I think I mentioned Tim Burton for the Batman 89 movie, but I kept referring to it as Batman 89. And I feel like I got to give props to Tim Burton because that's his vision. And I know I talked about how it started a Tim Burton obsession. But what I didn't talk about was how awesome Joe Dante is and how his vision for Gremlins really made that movie what it is. So I need to say, like, Joe Dante's a master of his craft. And I didn't say that enough in that episode.
I think people infer that from what you were saying.
Yeah.
We're recording on Super Bowl Sunday. Do you guys have any big plans for Super Bowl Sunday? I just had to look up who's playing because honestly, I had no idea.
Yeah. Well, Ariella and the girls actually Ariella and Faith, my wife and daughter Faith, they're more into sports than I am and that Gabby, our other daughter, is. But no, we're not going to do anything for Super Bowl. How about you? You and your family?
We go over to my sister's, and it's an excuse to eat, basically.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
All I knew about it is that there are 2 brothers, one on each team.
Yeah, that's right.
I've seen that on the news. But other than that...
I think that's pretty exciting. I know we're going to be like looking at the stats as the day progresses.
Alrighty, well, let's get into the big topics for this episode. Take us all the way back to when this began for you.
Uh-oh, that wall looks hungry.
So my obsession, for anybody that's familiar with my Skelevator YouTube channel, one of my ongoing obsessions has steadily been, it waxes and wanes a little bit. It's been just as steady as Star Wars, has been Masters of the Universe. And I didn't start getting into Masters of the Universe until Wave 2 of the action figures in 1983. but it was sort of in my periphery. Wave 1 came out in 1982, and I first got interested in 1983 when I saw Trapjaw on the shelf at Toys R Us. There's very few memories that I can remember this distinctly from my childhood. I remember walking in there with my dad, and I had a few dollars allowance money, and I was going to get something. I wasn't sure what I was going there to get, but when I walked in, right across from you know how in Toys R Us it had this sort of hallway? It was sort of like you walk down this hallway and then the anticipation, right? And then you turn the corner and then you're in the space. And as soon as I turned that corner, they had a whole wall of Masters of the Universe figures. And I had seen my friends had some of those figures from Wave 1, but I wasn't really into it. I saw Trapjaw. In Wave 2, there was Evil Lyn, Faker, Manny Faces, Ram Man, Trapjaw, Triclops. It was Trapjaw, called to me right from across the way. I walked right over to it. I knew that was what I was going to get. He has that articulated jaw, the switchable weapons on the right arm, and the color fluorescent green, bright blue, black, maroon. Such a cool figure. And that's where it started for me. And I hadn't started watching the cartoon. The cartoon came out in 1983 as well. I just pored over the pages in the mini comic that it came with. That's where I can say this at 46 years old, my lifelong obsession with Masters began.
Come on, Battle Cat. An Eternian snail can move faster than this.
Then I started getting into the TV series, and then I started really wanting to find the figures from Wave 1, Beastman, Skeletor, the original He-Man. Those figures were near impossible for me to find. I never ended up finding a Skeletor or getting a Skeletor as a gift or a Beastman. My interest in Trapjaw quickly transferred over to Skeletor and Beastman, primarily Beastman. When you're a kid, you have daydreams. I would just think about how cool the coloration of Beastman was. And I would just think like I would love to be Beastman for Halloween. I loved the action figure of Beastman. I wasn't keen on his cartoon version as much as I was of his action figure. And same with Skeletor and Trapjaw. And I started watching the cartoon. And when I'd go to the babysitter's house after school, we'd watch the cartoon. And even back then, I was always a little disappointed in how a lot of characters did not show up. It was just like the core characters that were in the show. And even then, you wouldn't get Trapjaw in every episode and other characters in every episode. And waiting for Merman and waiting for Beastman and waiting for Trapjaw to show up was really frustrating. And they didn't look like the action figures. And there wasn't a sort of barbaric, weird, there's weird again, sort of edgy aspect that you got in the mini comics. Even back then, there was sort of that ongoing elation and disappointment back and forth. Elation and disappointment, elation and disappointment. It continues to this day for fans of the franchise as well. The newest Kevin Smith version of Masters of the Universe that started in 2021, Revelation, a lot of fans just really were frustrated with that. My big argument is that when has that not been the case for Masters of the Universe? You have all these different designs and different characterizations. I mean, certain characters like Stratos, you weren't sure if he was a villain or a hero in the beginning, and then in the cartoon he became obviously a hero. And for those of you that listen to this podcast because you are a fan of the Skelevator YouTube channel, you know that Masters of the Universe is huge. It's a huge obsession for me, and it's always been there. I'm a huge fan of the super weird the 1990 New Adventures show that put He-Man in space. I hated it at the time because I was like going through puberty and I wasn't into action figures. And when I saw the figures on the shelf, I was like, that's not He-Man.
That's not my He-Man.
That's not my He-Man, right? That's the elation and disappointment thing back and forth. I've since grown to appreciate it. Similar to like Droids, right? You were just mentioning the Droids cartoon came out. I was like not interested at all because it wasn't my Star Wars. It was super cheesy.
Yeah, and for me, I was 16 when it came out.
Oh, yeah,
and
for sure.
I was not watching cartoons anymore.
Yeah, it's
Pretty
funny
sure
how-
I was not watching cartoons anymore.
Yeah. Well, I still was sneaking. I was still watching cartoons, but I just would never confess that to my friends.
Well,
right?
you would have only been like 9 or something, so
What I mean is when I was 16.
yeah.
And not willing to admit that I would be watching cartoons, but
Looney Tunes are for every age.
oh,
I don't think I was actively watching Saturday morning cartoons at age 16.
we're definitely going to be talking about Looney Tunes down the line in this show.
I'm curious because this is a thing that totally passed me by. Knowing that the show started in 82, so I was 13, I was already tossing off that's not a good term. I was dismissing, the stuff that I had been into as
Yeah.
far as comics and action figures and toys and stuff. That was going by the wayside by 13 for me, for sure. Probably wasn't really going to toy stores at that point. So I missed the whole thing. I think there was a documentary, and it may have been on either Prime or Netflix at some point. The show was created for the toys. I'm correct about that, right?
Yes, for sure.
So it was one of those backward engineering things where we've got this idea for this toy line. Let's create the show around that. So it sort of makes sense that a lot of those characters maybe didn't show up all the time. It's the inverse or reverse of Star Wars, where in those movies, and I'm specifically talking about the first 3 films, where even the most background of background characters that you see for a split second would become a toy, as opposed to let's just create all these toys and then maybe find a spot for them in the show from time to time.
So the documentary you're talking about was Power of Grayskull, the definitive history of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Yes, it was briefly on Netflix, and it's awesome. Rob McCallum, who I'm in contact with every once in a while, he directed that along with another fellow, I can't remember his name, but it talks about how the cartoon was really a commercial for these action figures.
Right. Yeah.
The figures come out. There's a whole series of mini comics that go with each figure. Was so cool is that each figure came with a different mini comic, which was awesome.
Oh, wow.
And then the cartoon comes out as a commercial for these figures, and it's not the same. I know I came to the line a little late, like a year later, but I still wanted, when I first saw the cartoon, I still wanted it to be like the mini comics. And I wanted the characters in the cartoon to look like the action figures. So yeah, you're right. It started off as a toy line, and then it turned into this cartoon. And the cartoon lasted from, 83 to 85, and was exactly like the G.I. Joe cartoon and the Transformers cartoon, these commercials for toys. And how different that is from previous IPs. Even Star Wars, the movie was first, right? And then the toys came. You had to wait for the toys if you wanted it.
Yeah, you
the
had
first
to.
wave.
We'll get into that at some point.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It all started with Star Wars, and then Mattel's like, you know what? We're going to do it differently. We're going to do these action figures and then have this cartoon to sort of support that. It's funny because it was totally reactionary, because Mattel initially passed up on the Star Wars IP, and they regretted it. So Masters is a reaction to that.
They never appealed to me as figures. I kind of hate that wrestling style body figure.
I understand that.
It's curious to me. I have a few Masters of the Universe figures, but they're like that initial prototype pack that Super 7 did of the reaction figures that they probably produced in multiple colorways by now.
Yep.
But it was just, solid colors, not muscle figures, and then some of their little vinyl things. I like the look of Skeletor and He-Man and a lot of the other figures as far as their clothing, but that muscle body wrestling style figure where everything's kind of bent, and even it seems like they're bent at the waist.
They're like in a crouching position.
It just never appealed to me. I don't know. I guess probably because Migos were so big for me that anything that wasn't just a straight static figure bored me, which seems weird to say, but
Well, no, it makes a lot of sense. And really, that's the first action figure line that experimented with here's an action stance, which is different from the static, like the Star Wars figures, the Mego figures. They're fairly static. The articulation, you can have them lift their arms and move their legs. The muscle-bound barbarian thing totally came from the Conan the Barbarian phase that was happening. There was sort of controversy of how He-Man was a theft of the whole Conan thing, and there's definite influence on the line from Conan. I was less interested in the muscles. It's funny, I'm connected with fans out there that it's all about the muscles. To me, it was all about the odd color choices, the odd combination of action features, of space and barbarian. That aesthetic really appealed to me. That's part of the reason why I'm with you on the reaction style version of those figures. I feel like it's less about the muscles, it's more about the strange design, the colors of these figures. I'm one of the Masters of the Universe fans that appreciates those reaction figures. I've got a lot of them.
you know what would be interesting? I just thought of if Mego ever did them.
It would be fantastic. I've been thinking about that forever. I would absolutely love that because Mego figures, for characters that show a lot of skin, it's often turned into like a costume.
Mm-hmm.
He-Man and the villains, there's a lot of skin color differences. So it would be these really great cloth costumes on the Mego figures.
Unfortunately, in this day and age, they probably wouldn't do that. I would love that.
Yeah.
Like Tarzan. I have a Tarzan. I never had one as a kid. It's a full bodysuit
Yeah.
instead of just trunks.
Yeah.
They would probably do trunks and stuff now, but they have a muscle body. I mean, I don't know if they've used it. I know that Figures Toy Company has used the muscle body on some figures. Mego had the Hulk and the Thing back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
That muscle body would work for most of the figures, I think.
Yeah, I think they should do it. It would be a hit. It would be huge.
It would be interesting. I'm curious. I mean, I'm sure that's a really expensive license, but they don't have any other figures in that scale currently, as far as I know.
No, in fact, they've closest thing to that scale were the 12-inch. Mattel did a reaction to the Gentle Giant Star Wars thing where they did 12-inch figures based on the original action figure design. So they've never had figures in the, 8-inch for Mego?
Mm-hmm.
They haven't done figures in the 8-inch scale. The closest they get is 7 inches, and some figures are a little bit taller than 7. But with those 7-inch figures, the classics and the Masterverse figures that are more recent, it's all about high detail. It's all about statuesque renditions of these characters that you want to just put on the shelf and have them be static. The Mego version of these characters would be all about the vintage Mego thing. So that would be similar to Reaction. That would provide a whole new retro angle to these characters' designs. I think that would be amazing. I've thought about that too.
The other consideration besides scale is that they would be cloth figures. I think that would help. If anybody from Mego is listening, get on that license. I'm sure it's really expensive, but they have some other expensive licenses too.
Oh my gosh, I mean, with Marvel and DC.
Well, they don't have... Nobody's doing Marvel 8-inch figures. I'm not sure... Well, that's another...
That's true.
Topic for another thing.
The recent ones have only been DC, huh? That's right.
But I mean, they have other... They've done Happy Days and Wizard of Oz, and...
Oh yeah, for
they
sure.
They do a bunch of horror ones, and...
Planet of the Apes, and...
Yeah.
I'm sure that to get the rights to produce the Scream Ghost and Freddy Krueger and stuff like that can't be cheap.
Yeah, I agree. Did you stick with this stuff like through high school when you got older?
I kind of strayed from it. I couldn't talk about it with friends. I mean, that's how it becomes in high school. You just don't talk about it. I mean, my experience, I've heard from people that were like, yeah, I had friends and we talk about that stuff.
They were nerds.
They were nerds. And my high school experience was weird because I went to high school in the mountains and there were these very distinct factions, and I was always never figuring out which group I belonged to. And I hung out with drama kids and hung out with punk kids. And
no toy nerd groups.
there were no toy nerd groups. They were video game nerds. I was not really that interested in that stuff either. I went through a Nintendo phase, but that faded quickly. And I took a break from Masters of the Universe, but it was always in the back of my mind. When the 1990 line came out, I had very strong feelings about not liking that stuff. Around the late 90s, right before the 2002 cartoon started, they did a commemorative series of action figures that they reissued the vintage figures. And I was like, okay, that's rad. But I was out of high school. I don't know if you remember this, but late 90s, every once in a while I'd throw a party and put on a VHS of Masters of the Universe cartoons, try and embrace the cheesiness of those Filmation cartoons in a young adult setting, drinking and laughing.
I don't have very clear memories of too many of those parties, which we won't get into right now.
Me neither. That's a whole other story.
We won't get into that stuff on this show.
In today's story, Elena tried taking a magic potion which she thought would help her. Well, she found out there aren't any magic potions. And you know what? There aren't any magic drugs either. Anytime you take one from anybody but your parents or your doctor, you're taking a very big chance. You're gambling with your health, maybe even your life. Drugs don't make your problems go away. They just create more.
Do you want to switch back to you? Because I got more to talk about, but we can switch to you and you can talk about...
Yeah, if you want to do that, break it up.
Yeah, let's break it up. Tell us about your obsession choice for today.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the show, this popped into my head, and we've both mentioned this as well, where, especially on that first episode, I've got my list of things that I've already thought of, and as we were talking, things would pop up. Oh, yeah, let me write that down. Sorry, remember. Let me write that down.
Yeah.
On that first episode, I mentioned, because of the Sesame Street discussion, that I had that Ernie plush that's sitting right with my homemade Mr. Bill plush that my mom made for me when I was a kid.
So cool.
And so I wrote down SNL stuff, Mr. Bill, and it just snowballed from there. So between the recording of that first episode and recording today, I just thought of all this other stuff that Saturday Night Live touched in my life as a young kid. And it just kept growing and growing and growing. And I would remember this and I'd remember that. And there were two big components of that. One of them was the Little Mr. Bill book that came out in 1979, which was easy to track down. I've looked for it in the past. I think it was when I found that Mr. Bill plush actually in the rafters, which was last year or the year before. We were looking for Carlita's old albums that she's convinced she saved. Couldn't find those. I found that stuff. And I was like, oh my God, I had that book. Looked it up on eBay, just didn't pull the trigger. The other thing was a book that I remembered having around the same time. Had no idea what the title was. Didn't know what to search for. I knew that it was an oversized, like coffee table sized book, so folio sized, and that it had on the cover the cast in that hand tinted picture style that they used for the opening of the show for a number of years. But I had it in my head that it was called the Not Ready for Primetime Players. I remember that phrase distinctly because at the time when I got the book, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what primetime meant in regard to TV, and so I didn't know what not ready for primetime meant. And so I would put these search items in Google or on eBay. Not ready for primetime players, coffee table book. The only things that would come up were this issue of a Marvel Comics, and I forget what it is. It's not What If, but it's a Spider-Man team up. I think it's Marvel team up. So they had, Spider-Man and so-and-so, this person and so-and-so. So it was Spider-Man and the Not Ready for Primetime Players with pictures of the cast on there, and John Belushi as the samurai front and center. And I'm like, well, it wasn't that. And then the only thing that kept coming up repeatedly was this Rolling Stone item called Rolling Stone Visits Saturday Night Live. And I'm like, well, that's not it either. The picture was kind of right. It was one of those hand-tinted pictures, but I had no recollection of Rolling Stone being on the cover, being in the title. So I kept ignoring that, kept trying to search for it, did another like SNL book, 1970 something, to see what would come up. And a few of the writers of the show made a book in the late 70s, but it was like scripts of skits and some pictures. And I'm like, no, that wasn't it. And so finally, I went to the Internet Archive, or one of the links to that Rolling Stone book led to the Internet Archive. You can, quote unquote, check out books from there. I went through the first couple of pages and it still wasn't clicking. I'm like, I just don't think Rolling Stone was involved in this. I signed up. It's a free sign-up thing. I signed up on the Internet Archive so I could look at the rest of the book. And I didn't get very far in, and I realized, oh yes, this is the book I had. So down in the corner, there's a little ribbon, and it says, the Not Ready for Primetime Players, interviews with the Blues Brothers, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh. So it wasn't even a title, it wasn't the subtitle, it was just the phrase that stuck with me. Paged through the whole thing on that Internet Archive. It's like, oh, well, yeah, this is absolutely it. Every picture hit that memory receptor in my brain.
Yeah.
Pictures of the Blues Brothers. There's one picture of Mr. Bill in there. You know, they talked with some of the hosts, the famous hosts from that first 5 seasons. So there's Steve Martin pictures and Buck Henry and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, this is absolutely it. So I went to eBay. There's tons of copies on there. Found one that was in very good condition for a nice price. Got that. Got their Mr. Bill book. They both arrived within 2 or 3 days. So that book and the Mr. Bill book encompass this idea of where I didn't really watch the show. Right. It was all peripheral, kind of like with you discovering this action figure, not having been really watching the He-Man show yet. So the show started in 75. I was 6. Obviously had no idea, didn't watch it. But I would say by 1978, I was aware of the show. Probably because of seeing kids wear shirts of the characters, because I know there was a Conehead shirt.
Yep.
I remember that distinctly, and I remember ads in comic books or posters and t-shirts. For a kid, the Coneheads would be intriguing because it's weird looking.
Right.
And so you hear about this stuff, and I'm sure there were clips on the news or stuff in the newspaper. You know, this is all pre-internet. It's like, where do you get this information? It has to be from other kids. It's got to be from the people around you. It has to be from seeing something on the news. The first thing that I can distinctly remember being connected to Saturday Night Live was Animal House. That was because of John Belushi. That came out in 78. I was only 9. There was no way Mom was going to be taking us to that. A friend of mine, though, had the soundtrack, and I borrowed it and fell in love with that soundtrack.
Oh, yeah.
It's got little clips of the movie in between the songs, but it has all those great early 60s songs. Louie Louie, and then the stuff that Otis Day and the Night sing. And I think I borrowed it indefinitely. And I know that I was still pretty young because my sister didn't have her record player yet, so I had to listen to that tape out in the family room on my parents' old clunky wood grain cassette player receiver combination. Listen to it constantly. Probably one of my first musical experiences that wasn't influenced by my parents. You know, it wasn't Neil Diamond or the Carpenters. It was something that was my own, and I could hear little bits of the movie because of it.
It's good to know there are other people out there raised on Neil Diamond and the Carpenters,
who I love to this day. All this music, Animal House, Neil Diamond, Carpenters, Simon and Garfunkel, they're all on my phone.
For me, add in the Stand By Me soundtrack, but that came later. I have a question for you, and I've been thinking about this actually since you and I have been talking a little bit about early SNL. we had mentioned in passing briefly the phenomenon of knowing who Truman Capote is and Andy Warhol and these characters from pop culture, knowing who they are without knowing who they are as kids.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with Saturday Night Live, though I do not believe that phenomenon still exists for Saturday Night Live today. And I could be wrong because I'm not a kid anymore, but I feel like there was a quality that the early seasons of Saturday Night Live carried, which kids would pick up on. The Jaws shark at the door.
Who is it?
Land shark.
Oh, Walter.
The Coneheads, John Belushi as the samurai, King Tut, Steve Martin, like all those things we maybe found out about it from our parents. There was a pop culture phenomenon that kids could pick up on related to Saturday Night Live too, which just doesn't exist anymore.
There are probably other things like video games and
Yeah,
Five Nights at Freddy's or something like that.
right.
I'm pretty sure is an adult geared game, but kids pick up on it because of the character design. So stuff like that still happens. It's just in the ether and you just somehow absorb it. I think the first episode I ever saw, and I probably didn't see it all the way through, and it may have been a rerun of the episode because it's season 2, episode 8. So that was 76, sometime in 1976, and I still would have been too young to be staying up that late. But I remember very distinctly when Paul Simon was the host, and might have been his second appearance as host, where he comes out in a turkey suit, plays a song in a turkey suit, and then he and George Harrison perform a couple of songs together. And I was also getting into the Beatles at the time, and I just remember it confusing me because I knew who Simon and Garfunkel was because my parents had that greatest hits tape. And they did Here Comes the Sun. I knew that song, but I knew it was a Beatles song. And I'm like, why are these two? Were these two together at some point? Well, what's going on? But that is one of the most vivid memories I have, though, is watching those two guys perform that song together.
Yeah.
Don't know when I watched it, but it would have been sometime between when it aired and probably 1980 or so. Maybe every once in a while when my parents would go out on a Saturday night, we had a babysitter, or even after they came home and let's say me and my sister were still up, we might have caught the first half hour or so of the show. Watching it in toto wouldn't come until years later, but picking up on all those pieces and those characters and the actors that made those characters was the big thing, because a lot of what I would then explore or look for involved John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, and Bill Murray, etc. You know, Animal House is one of those things. You mentioned King Tut, the Steve Martin bit, and it was played on the radio.
King Tut, how'd you get so funky?
This is interesting because I think it was last year there was this Twitter hubbub. Steve Martin was trending because somebody had posted that clip of him doing King Tut on Saturday Night Live. And they're like, why is this funny? How do you convince somebody that something's funny?
Right.
But that wasn't really the point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a funny song. I think it's funny. But the point was that it was Tutamania at that time. Yeah. When that King Tut exhibit traveled across the country, it was a huge deal in whatever, 77, 78. So I think we got the 45 of King Tut. But what eventually happened is his album, A Wild and Crazy Guy, came out in 1979.
Because I am a wild and crazy.
Because of King Tut, we asked my mom to get it for us. So in 79, I was 10, my sister was 12. And this story in my head all takes place in one afternoon. Mom brings the album home, we're listening to it. She goes and visits some family friends of ours who have older sons, a couple of years older than my sister, quite a few years older than me. She goes, mentions that she bought us the Steve Martin album, or maybe one of them had it, I don't know. She's like, oh, I just got that for the kids. And they mentioned to her, oh, it's very naughty.
Uh-oh.
I had this idea in my head that she's then racing home. They lived very close to us. Coming home, coming in, just as we're listening. By this time, I think my sister had her record player because I remember us sitting in her room and listening to it. Get towards the end of the album, and there's this one joke.
Now, this doesn't happen very often, but about 3 weeks ago, I met a girl, and she was real nice, and she invited me to her apartment. So I went over there, and she had the best pussy I have ever seen. Oh, now, come on! I'm talking about her cat. Now, that makes me sick right there. No, you can't say anything anymore that people don't take it dirty, and I'm sorry, that disgusts me. That cat was the best fuck I ever had.
I don't think she took it away from us or anything. I remember I've listened to almost the whole album. You can get it on iTunes.
Yeah.
I know that I listened to it quite a bit because I was finishing the jokes. I was saying the punchlines as it was playing. Unfortunately, I don't have that album in my records that survived childhood.
I think we have that record in our collection. We found it at, I'll have to go look over there, but we did find a Steve Martin record, and I think that's the one. We found it at a thrift store.
It's black and white, and he's coming out behind some really big speakers with his bunny ears on.
Yep, that's the one. We have it.
Yeah, so it's part of the clip called an expose. So if you get to that track, it's like in the middle of that spiel. So there was that. And then movies were starting to come out. You know, Chevy Chase left early in the second season to do movies. So something like Foul Play would come out, which I saw on TV and really liked. Still my favorite Chevy Chase movie because he's not an idiot in it. He's kind of an idiot, but not bumbling. That shtick has never really appealed to me.
Really? Some of my favorite moments are him just bumbling, being a total idiot. You know, The First Vacation is one of my favorite comedies of all time.
It wears thin on me. Sometimes I can handle it, but it gets old for me after a while.
I can see why.
Animal House, like I mentioned, and then, of course, the next big one, or the next big two, I'll say, because these both came out in 1980, and they both starred Saturday Night Live alum. And by this time, in 1980, all of the original cast was gone, and Lorne Michaels. So The Blues Brothers comes out summer of 1980, and Caddyshack comes out the summer of 1980.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm 11, my sister's 13. For whatever reason, my mom decides, first R-rated movie, pick. And it was between those two movies. At least for me, in my head, it was between those two movies. I think we made the wrong choice. We went and saw Caddyshack, which I liked, but it's much raunchier than The Blues Brothers. So it was a little uncomfortable being 11 and seeing that stuff. But I got really into The Blues Brothers. Missed my chance to see the movie. Their look with the sunglasses, here come the sunglasses again, the suits, everything. I don't know if I'd seen any clips from them on this show or not at that point. Again, this is the peripheral stuff. Didn't see the movie. I got the soundtrack and I got the novelization. I don't know how many times I read that novelization, but I read it quite a few times, listened to the album constantly. And the novelization is great because it's basically Dan Aykroyd's bloated, overwritten script that was like 350 pages. It's basically that. Every band member gets their side story.
That's cool.
They don't find half of them at the Holiday Inn like they do in the movie. They have to track down every member of the band. And of course, it came with pictures, so I would look at that, listen to the album, read the book.
So cool.
And that is the one thing that I couldn't, well, I found it. I couldn't get because apparently it's very coveted and rare.
Oh,
the cheapest I could find a copy of that, and it's just a paperback.
Yeah.
It was just ended up in grocery stores and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like $59.
No way.
I'm going to keep looking. If I can find one under 20, I might actually get it because I'm really curious. I know that there's so much more in the book than is in the movie, and so much more in the book that's even in the extended versions of the movie.
And to reread that would bring that whole experience back to you.
Oh, yeah. the first time I saw the movie, which was probably on TV, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
There are like 5 of them are in the band at the Holiday Inn. That's not fun. It makes sense for the movie.
They did that whole thing, that whole shtick when the Muppets came back and they did that movie, The Muppets, where they had to find all the original members of the Muppet Show, go around and find them in their odd jobs and bring them back into the fold. That whole thing again shows up there in that movie.
Well, I'm sure that is a nod to the Blues Brothers.
Absolutely.
Because there is a definite connection between Saturday Night Live and the Muppets.
Oh, certainly.
They were on, well, we'll get to that. So I kind of skipped over something and went a little bit out of order here. But actually, the first movie that I saw with Saturday Night Live people in it was 1941. And I saw that in the theater, and I'm pretty sure it was because of John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd being in it. And I absolutely loved that movie. And I know that I rented it a lot. It's on Crackle right now for anybody that's interested. Steven Spielberg's flop, apparently. It still holds up for me. I still think it's absolutely wonderful.
I haven't seen that since I was a kid. I need to see that again.
I don't think when I saw it... Well, I know I hadn't seen Jaws yet because the opening didn't ring any bells except for the music, which, of course, everybody knows was associated with Jaws. So he spoofs himself at the beginning of the movie. Got the same girl back and everything. I don't think I knew. I just think it was somebody spoofing Jaws. I didn't even know it was a Steven Spielberg movie. First Steven Spielberg movie I saw in the theater. And I didn't know until years later that it was considered a failure. You know, after Jaws, after Close Encounters, I can understand that. It didn't fail at the box office. It made money. Right. But people are like, it's over. You know, it's bloated. It's over. I loved it then. I think it holds up, and it's due for a reappraisal. But that was definitely, that 1979, 1980, 81, I was really heavy into all the people from the show. At some point, and I don't know how I got his address, you mentioned finding Jack Nicholson's house.
Yeah.
I probably wrote, I'm pretty sure I wrote to at least Steve Martin and Chevy Chase for autographed pictures. I don't know where I got the addresses or where I sent it. Could have been from an ad in a comic book again. I don't know. You know, get signed autographs from these. I did get a signed Chevy Chase picture when I was a kid. Whether it was signed by him, I have no idea. Just a headshot. I don't even think it said to Mark. He probably just sat at a desk and signed his name on hundreds of pictures.
Do you still have it?
No, I think it ended up being stored in that Saturday Night Live book I had. None of that Saturday Night Live stuff survived, except for my Mr. Bill plush. Animal House, 1941, those 2 books, and then catching maybe little bits and pieces of the show up until that point were my experience with it. I'm currently reading that book. I don't even know if I actually read the book when I was a kid. I think I just looked at the pictures. There's the samurai, like I said, Mr. Bill. I think there's a King Tut picture. Bill Murray and Gilda Radner as those nerds. It's funny seeing that stuff out of context. A lot of what I would be into as a kid was out of context, and then you finally get to it. Which, by the time I was in high school, with the reruns that they would show and the new casts, Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo and Billy Crystal, that's when I'm old enough to be aware of it and to watch it. And the other thing I remember seeing, again, I don't know if it was at first run or a rerun. I think for a lot of years I thought this was a fever dream or something that I made up in my head. But in the mid-70s, there was a Beach Boys special on NBC. They were becoming real popular again because that Endless Summer double LP Greatest Hits collection had come out. So NBC does this special. I think it's most famous for showing Brian Wilson, who's gotten quite heavy now, full beard, laying in bed, and talking to the camera.
I've seen that clip, and it's just phenomenal. No wonder, right? I mean, that's epic. That is epic.
I distinctly remember Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi showing up, and dragging him out of the house to
That's
make him
right.
surf, and thinking how weird that was. Well, found out just yesterday, actually, Lorne Michaels produced that special. He was a big fan of the Beach Boys.
Oh.
Brian Wilson hosts at some point, I think, in the second season.
Brian Wilson was the musical guest, not the host, on episode 9 of season 2.
He brought along Belushi and Eckert. I'm sure there's other SNL people on that thing as well. It would be interesting to watch that whole thing again. I remember watching it as a kid, but like I said, I don't know when.
That's amazing. I rewatched it, or I watched it for the first time about 10 years ago. I don't even remember where I found it. I may even just have rented it from the video store I was working at, or found that clip on something that I rented from that video store, because we had a lot of like bootleg stuff there. That scene of Belushi and Dan Aykroyd dragging him out to the beach is just phenomenal.
Yes, and of course, they weren't even surfers, so, or at least
No.
Brian Wilson. Dennis Wilson might have been, but, you know, they weren't really surf guys.
It's so funny.
The other movie, and I always forget about this one, that I went and saw in the theater was How to Beat the High Cost of Living. I don't know if you've ever seen it or ever heard of it. Jane Curtin,
I have heard of it, yeah.
Susan St. James, and Jessica Lange. And I don't know if it's something that I asked to go see just because Jane Curtin was. I could see Saturday Night Live being that much of a draw that I'd be like, oh, one of the cast members is in this. It's PG. Please take me to it. The only thing I remember about that movie is that Jane Curtin, well, her body double, flashes her tits. It was 1980. I was 11. 1980 was a big year for me in boobies because there's definitely boobies in Caddyshack.
Yep, certainly.
And there's boobies in How to Beat the High Cost of Living. And then I believe Dragon Slayer came out in 1980.
Oh, come on.
Dragon Slayer was released in 1981, another good year for movie boobs.
You know, Disney, hello, showing boobies and dong.
That scene in Dragon Slayer is burned into my memory. Probably singularly marking my official graduation into having boy thoughts about girls. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a stunner. That was a very shocking reveal. And I'm sitting there, you know, at that point, I don't know. I mean, we got dropped off at movies, but I have a feeling my mom was there. And it's like, ooh, so mortified to be watching boobies. But I've shown that to Cleo. That's another one that holds up. And that fucking dragon in that movie is amazing.
It's the best dragon I've ever seen in a movie ever, and still to this day. And I'm talking about the amazing special effects in Game of Thrones. Those dragons are great too. It's not the same. It's just not the same. CGI is not the same as practical effects. I don't care what people say. The dragon in Dragon Slayer is perfect.
It's pretty amazing.
It's also it's just a damn good movie. Like, that movie is great.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So I have a few other things that we'll get to when we switch back. So let's get back to your Motu obsession.
Skeletor to King Randor! Skeletor to King Randor! Come in, you royal boob!
As I was saying, it was always kind of a back and forth with me and Masters of the Universe, back and forth. Right around the time where the new show, the Mike Young Productions version of the show came out in 2002, I was getting ready to move to New York. The figures were coming out, and I got a couple of them, and I would watch an episode here and there. I believe it was on Cartoon Network. In 2003, I was living in New York City. I was working at a fancy pants hotel health center, and I would go in. I'd get there at 5 o'clock in the morning and get it set up for people who'd come in who wanted to go in and use the treadmills and stuff like that. And I'd get there early enough to get the fruit-infused water all gussied up and the place looking good and towels folded. And while I was doing that, I would turn on Cartoon Network that was still showing reruns of this show. And I would get to it was natural. And it's funny, sort of like Saturday Night Live for you, or many of these IPs, it's just naturally I'm drawn to it. So I know that somehow I looked up the schedule, the air dates and times of these shows, and it turned out that that was the right time to watch it. I'd turn it on, it'd be on while I was working, and then I'd got to make sure that it's off by the time the first person comes in to use the facilities. But I really enjoyed that brief period of time where I was living there and reconnecting with my childhood through this new version of the show. The 2002 Mike Young Productions series did a lot of the stuff that I wanted to be in the Filmation show, which was spend a lot of time with characters, give them their origin stories, and it was really a refreshing rendition of the stories of Masters of the Universe characters. And then after that, it was a long break again. Then Masters of the Universe Classics started coming out around 2008-ish. They reissued the Filmation cartoon, and I just got interested again, and I bought a few animation cells, and I couldn't afford the action figures, but the animation cells were super cheap. I still have...
Have you shown me those?
I don't think so. Okay. I had them in storage for many years. When I moved back to Fresno, they were still in storage. When we moved in here in Fowler, I was able to pull them out, and I got them hanging up. Next time you're here, I'll show you. They're pretty cool. There's 2 of them. And then I couldn't really afford the Classics action figures because money was tight. So I missed out on that whole thing. And for those of you that don't know, there was a whole run of action figures that Mattel came out with starting around 2008 that were deluxe, highly detailed versions of the original action figures. And then later on, a lot of figures that were never released, and a lot of nods to the different cartoon iterations of the franchise. And I picked up a couple of those along the way. And then finally, when I got a real job, I was able to start collecting again. And that brings us to the most recent, like maybe about 5 years worth of re-establishing my vintage collection, buying some of the new stuff. Since 2020, there's been the Origins line that's come out, the Masterverse line that have come out, the new cartoon from Kevin Smith, a new CGI cartoon for kids. And it seems like with the 40th anniversary having just passed, and it's been this like huge resurgence, and it's been so much fun. I'm getting ahead of myself, kind of like you did a little bit. Before 2020 and 2019, I was like, I want to build a Castle Grayskull. I want that Castle Grayskull to be 3-dimensional, 4 walls with access to different levels with stairways and rooms, and big enough for the 7-inch Classics figures and accommodate in a fairly realistic scale the vintage figures as well. There had been a Classics version of the Castle Grayskull released, which was way out of my league as far as spending money on a playset, so I wanted to build one myself. I had messed around with sculpture as an artist before a little bit, not to this extent, and I was nervous, but I had to do it. We joke about it in our household, but it was very much like this. You know that scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind where Richard Dreyfuss...
That was what was coming into my head already.
Yeah, Richard Dreyfuss making that mashed potato mountain.
Or how about the one where he's tearing everybody's yards apart so he can make the big one in his house? That's what I thought of.
Yeah. But that first scene where he's putting the mashed potatoes on the plate and his wife's like, oh my God, what's going on? And then the camera pans over to his kids and one of the kids is crying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, our daughters were not, they weren't that affected by it. But I know that my wife was like a little worried about what was going on, me going out, me gathering these materials and salvaging styrofoam from old packages and getting stuff from Home Depot and watching these YouTube videos on how to make dioramas. It was really, that is the marker for when my interest in Masters of the Universe, or re-interest in Masters of the Universe, sort of entered midlife crisis territory.
You kicked it up to another level.
Totally kicked it up to another level. That's when our daughters were like, you should make a YouTube video. Our youngest helped me develop the Skelevator name because I like Star Wars villains and I like Masters villains.
Smart kid.
Very smart kid. So I started documenting everything, and that's where it all began. Then I went on to make a Snake Mountain and Fright Zone. And as you were talking about at the beginning of this episode, in January, I had an exhibit where I got to show those off. They all now belong to other people. I was offered the opportunity to put them on exhibit and was able to let people come and experience those gigantic.
Yeah, bigger than I even realized from watching the videos or seeing pictures. So, and I have my own pictures too. So that one behind you, though, isn't the one you made, is it?
No, that's a reissue of, well, not a reissue, but the newest version of the Castle Grayskull playset that came out for the Origins line. It's the same scale as the vintage one, but a slightly different design.
Didn't Super 7 also do a playset?
They did Snake Mountain.
And that one was pricey too, right?
Yeah, it was very pricey. That's kind of what got me motivated to make a giant Snake Mountain 2. It was those two playsets. Classics Grayskull is huge and expensive. Mattel did that one. And then when Super 7 took over the rights to create Classics figures, the last thing that they released after they returned the rights to make those figures to Mattel was their Snake Mountain. Their Snake Mountain was huge and incorporated aspects of the original playset and aspects of Snake Mountain that we only saw in the cartoon, because there were two very different Snake Mountains, the one in the cartoon versus the playset toy, the original vintage one. So they incorporated aspects of both, and it's enormous. It's like, I'd say 3 feet wide by 2.5 feet tall, maybe.
Wow.
I was like, forget it. I'm going to do 4.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall, nearly 5 feet tall.
Wow.
And I wanted it to do the same thing, incorporate aspects of the vintage playset a little bit, but mostly showcase the design elements of the Filmation cartoon. Yeah, that playset I finally saw one in person. I don't know if you watched my video walkthrough. I went to I reconnected with an old friend from the Fresno music scene, James. He actually reconnected with me because he's been experiencing a renaissance of Masters, of reinterest in Masters. He did purchase that Super 7 Snake Mountain, and I finally got to see one in person. And
no, I didn't watch that one. I'll check it out.
Yeah, check it out. It's last month, January.
Put out so much stuff, it's hard to keep up, Ronald.
You do too. I like when I see a new thing pop up for you because I'm like, okay, good.
I haven't put anything out in almost a month.
Well, I've been listening to the Police Squad episodes. Oh, yeah. Those are good. There's that. And it's actually been making me think it's funny because you're talking about in that, not to change the subject.
Change it. Who cares? No one's listening to this shit.
You were watching.
And if you are, thank you.
Yes, and if you are, thank you. You were watching Police Squad episodes, rewatching them before you watched them for these episodes you're doing with Mike and Chris. And what was that, like 2 years ago?
Yeah, it was sometime in the last couple of years.
Yeah, me too. It's weird. I started watching them again around the same time. We never talked about it. It's so funny. Yeah, those are great. I'm enjoying those.
Got another month to go on that stuff.
That's right.
Check that out from the Files of Police Squad, also on weirdingwaymedia.com.
That's right. It's good stuff.
Yeah, that exhibit was crazy, seeing the actual scale of things. Even though I know I've watched the build videos, and everybody who's listening who doesn't know about Ronnie's YouTube channel, it's always linked in the show notes. So check that out, and you can see him building a lot of these items, and they're pretty crazy. I
just got a commission to do a new Snake Mountain. So this guy in Bakersfield put a down payment on a Snake Mountain that's going to be 4x4, so 4 feet tall by 4 feet long. You can watch those videos starting here probably the end of February. I'm going to start building.
And you've got videos for toy hunts, videos for figures that you purchased, all kinds of stuff. And not just Masters of the Universe as well. There's a lot of other stuff in there.
Yeah, Weekly Weirdo every Sunday, and Toy Frenzy. I talk with some other folks about toys every Thursday night. So yeah, there's a lot going on over there.
Yeah, man. Keeping busy.
Mm-hmm.
Nerd.
Gots to.
I'm going to put in the Homer Simpson nerd clip right here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's perfect.
Nerd!
And you're still finding figures
Oh,
from
yeah.
all these different lines. Are you getting the space laser versions from the 1992 show that you mentioned?
Yeah, so
Or are they too
I picked up
expensive?
the vintage ones are a little pricey if you find them complete, but I did pick up an incomplete Skeletor from the 1990 line and Slush Head, who's got like a goopy green guy and his head's in an aquarium-shaped dome. And another figure that's his head's an eyeball. I got those. If I run across them at an affordable price, it's very hard to resist. Those villains from the 1990 line are super strange. They take the weird to a whole other level.
I'm going to ring a bell through the episode. Whenever you say weird, I'm going to ring a bell.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my favorite word.
I can see the cogs turning,
Oh, yeah.
and you're trying to avoid it, but one just slipped through.
I'm going to embrace it. I'm going to get a t-shirt that
Who
says
cares?
weird.
I didn't even notice it, so if I didn't notice it, no one else will, because I got to listen to this thing like 3 times and edit it, and it takes forever. I wouldn't worry about it too much. Yeah,
Right.
a lot of those, even the ones that I see either on your videos or I just come across through other toy stuff, they've got some pretty funky designs.
Oh, yeah. It's like people just pushing the limits as far as design goes with the Masters characters, and I love that.
Why not?
They are strange.
It's a fantasy realm. Go for it.
Exactly. Go for it.
But why can't I join your gang?
Cause you were a whip scientist and you could be a whip villain.
So one of the culminations of this early fascination that was probably really just strongest between 79 and 81 was my 6th grade year. So that was 80 to 81. I was 11 going on 12. And this was when I switched schools, or they switched schools for us. The MGM program switched from Easterby to the new school Air, which had just opened. This is what they used to call it, mentally gifted minors. Now it's GATE, or it was GATE for a long time.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
So it was a magnet school, so you get kids from all over the area to go to these schools. And we got the most feared 6th grade teacher of all. This is Little John.
Oh, I love that. That's so great.
She was pretty ruthless, but she got incredibly sick very shortly into the school year. She was diagnosed with cancer, so she was gone for a good chunk of the year. So we had this rotating lineup of subs, because I think they would get rid of them after a certain point, so they didn't have to pay them more. If you're a long-term sub, you get paid more per day.
Right.
So we had like 3 or 4 subs that would be there for weeks on end. At one point, I used this to our advantage because subs didn't really, and I was a sub for a long time, so I know this, subs don't really know the full routine or what's going on necessarily. So I convinced one of our subs that we were putting on a play, that we were practicing for writing, doing all this stuff for a play. And I was the writer and the producer, and I guess the director of this play. And it was my riff on Saturday Night Live skits. So I had seen enough, absorbed enough, the humor that, more of the absurd type humor, like Landshark, like you mentioned, like Coneheads, just some of the offbeat stuff was what really took hold with me. The only thing I can remember from it, we did Weekend Update and everything. So it actually, we actually ended up doing this. I took this excuse to get me and my friends out of class and actually created a play and performed it for the rest of the class. I remember the Weekend Update, or having a Weekend Update segment, and then the only skit I remember, and it's because of the title, was the Satanic Scarf of Santa Claus. And for me, that just sums up in my head what I thought about Saturday Night Live. And I don't know if it's a direct ripoff of something from Saturday Night Live. It very well could be.
Yeah.
I'll get to that eventually because I'm working my way through the show right now. I used Saturday Night Live as an excuse to get out of class at some point in sixth grade.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh.
And again, by this point, like even with the book, that book came out shortly before that original cast all left. Lorne Michaels left. I remember stuff I mentioned, you know, Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo and Billy Crystal were kind of the big names of that in-between phase. But the season that I remember watching for the first time all the way through, I think it's the 11th season, and so this was 85 to 86, I assume, and it's considered probably one of, if not the worst season of the show. Michaels came back, fired everybody that was there before, which was probably like, I don't know, Christopher Guest and Julia Louis-Dreyfus and all those people. Fired all those people, brought on Joan Cusack, Robert Downey Jr., Nora Dunn, Anthony Michael Hall.
Oh my goodness.
Randy Quaid.
What?
John Lovitz, Dennis Miller, Terry Sweeney, and Denitra Vance.
That's interesting. So I must have started watching after that while Dennis Miller was still on. Yes, and John Lovitz was still on, but those other people had left. That's fascinating.
I watched it because of Anthony Michael Hall and Robert Downey Jr.
Of course.
I mean, I watched the show because I was 16 by that point and I could stay up. If I wasn't out with my friends or at somebody's house, or even if I was at somebody's house, if I was old enough to stay up now past 11:30 and actually watch the show. The other reason is because we had a VCR by then, so I could record it if I wasn't home. So that is the first season that I remember watching all the way through.
Right.
I really liked it. I'll get to that eventually and see just how bad it is because, like I said, it's one of the most reviled seasons.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see, but I remember enjoying a lot of the skits, and so Dennis Miller, John Lovitz, and Nora Dunn are the only people that returned the next season and continued for quite a while. I mean, Dennis Miller was probably the most popular Weekend Update host since Chevy Chase, and John Lovitz has created just amazing characters.
John Lovitz is amazing.
I think that first episode of that season that he was on, his pathological liar character was presented on that first episode.
So good. So brilliant.
People that maybe don't know, some of the Brat Pack were in a season of Saturday Night Live for some inexplicable reason.
That is so funny. I don't know how I missed that completely.
The other thing that happened was, I remember when John Belushi died, and where I was, we had gone to dinner at the old Spaghetti Factory when it used to be out on Ventura Street,
right
underneath the overpass of 41 there. And I think my dad mentioned it, and I was like, what? I'm pretty sure at that point I was still really into them as just, I mean, I saw Continental Divide, for Pete's sake.
Yeah.
I enjoyed him as an actor and as a character, and a lot of the stuff that he created from that show and beyond. I liked him in movies and would watch that, and I know I was still interested in the Blues Brothers at that point. So that was one of the first, like John Lennon a couple years prior, and then John Belushi were ones that sort of hit me really hard as a kid. So that old Spaghetti Factory will creep back up here in a little bit when we close out. I think I mentioned already that, I got the book, so I'm reading through it again. Kind of disheartening that they talk about the female cast members' weight so much in the book. It just makes me think of the time that it was written and stuff. Because they were all, Jane Curtin, especially Lorraine Newman and Gilda Radner, were like rail thin.
Yeah, that's true.
Back then in the show, and they mention not only that, but how they were all heavy girls when they were younger, and all this stuff. And it's like, do we really need to talk? Are we talking about Chevy Chase's weight when he was a kid? No. So I'm reading through the book.
Disappointing.
Probably for the first time in full. And I'm also, because of all this, thinking of this, doing this for the show, I realized I've never actually sat through the first 5 seasons of the show completely. I've seen famous skits from them, obviously. They've released, those best of compilations, like Best of Dan Aykroyd, Best of John Belushi, so you see all their big hits. I never actually watched those
Right.
episodes all the way through. So I'm up to. So in the morning when I'm working, I had that on in the background.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty hit and miss for a lot of the first season, but there's classic stuff on there. My favorite Garrett Morris bit is on there.
I'm gonna get me a shotgun and kill all the whiteys I see.
Samurai shows up early.
Yep.
The precursor to the Blues Brothers when they perform in bee outfits is on there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Chevy Chase as the Weekend Update host. His cold opens every episode. So a lot of it's already there, but some of the episodes are really weird. Like the Paul Simon episode, his first appearance is just all music and some commercials. There's no skits.
That's strange.
George Carlin doesn't really perform in any of the skits. He just does
Stand-up comedy.
stand-up stuff.
Yep.
And then, of course,
Yep.
Andy Kaufman's on that first episode. But there's classic stuff. The last one I watched was season 2, episode 5, Steve Martin's first appearance,
Mm-hmm.
which I was really excited about, but it was kind of a dud. Elliot Gould's been on a couple times, Buck Henry, all this stuff. So I'm working my way through at least those first seasons with the original cast. I don't know. I will probably watch that 11th season out of curiosity at some point.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to watch that original stuff. I haven't gotten to Coneheads yet, but they're coming up this season. I haven't gotten to Jane, You Ignorant Slut yet, which is something I remember from childhood. Had no idea what slut meant, but I remember hearing or seeing that clip.
Jane, you ignorant slut.
So many Office fans will never understand where that came from. They'll just think it's Michael Scott.
Right? Exactly. Father Guido Sarducci, I always remember enjoying him when he was on. So I'm working through all that stuff. We'll probably finish the book and those episodes of the show. But it was just one of those pop culture phenomenons. They won the Emmy that first season. It was just in the ether, in the zeitgeist. And it affected a lot of what I liked. I still watch the Blues Brothers constantly. I watched it like 3 times between recording last time and this time.
Oh, wow.
If I catch that movie, I have to finish it.
I need to watch it again. It's been a very long time since I've watched that all the way through.
I have to say, it has got to be one of my favorite movies of all time. And I mentioned Caddyshack being raunchy and being kind of the wrong choice. There's swearing in the Blues Brothers, but it's almost childlike. It's almost like a kid made this movie.
Yeah.
It's very innocent. Even though they're convicts and all this stuff, it has a very innocent feel to it.
I remember that from watching it. Remember that feeling. That innocence is what gives it its sort of like a dreamlike quality, and also like a level of enthusiasm behind the whole thing that doesn't exist in a lot of movies, in the similar veins.
And the last thing, I mentioned the Ray-Bans, but looking for Bob Geldof's, between that and these came first because this came out in 1980. Sunnyside Pharmacy, just right down the strip mall from the Sunnyside Library and right next to Christensen's Market. They had sunglasses.
Yeah.
And I would just stare at those Ray-Bans, and they were pretty pricey even back then.
Oh yeah.
But I did eventually in high school get Ray-Bans, and it was because they were popular again in the mid to late 80s, those and Varnays for people that remember that. But I did eventually get Ray-Bans, and they are mentioned so many times in the novelization. I don't know if they used the little trademark symbol in the book, but it was always like with their Ray-Bans, this Ray-Ban, right. So I knew what they were because of the novelization.
It explains so much of your style.
I don't walk around in black suits and pork pie hats.
No, but the Ray-Bans.
Ray-Bans have always been there. I'm wearing Ray-Bans right now.
That's right.
That covers Saturday Night Live for me. I'm looking at my notes, and I never get to everything in my notes, but I think I did this time. So people, if you've gone through both of our lengthy, I'm sure mine is lengthier, discussions on these 2 topics, thank you so much for sticking with us.
I think I got through all my lists too.
Good.
For things like this, Masters and SNL, they'll always come up in our conversations in some way, because I feel like there's something that makes such a big impact. It's a through line.
Yeah.
It'll always pop up.
which is what I was realizing as
Yeah, for sure.
from writing that little note down the first time we talked
Yeah.
to 2 months later and just, going like
Absolutely.
How to Beat the High Cost of Living. I haven't thought about that movie in ages, but
Yeah.
now I'm curious to watch it again. It apparently flopped, but it's got boobies in it, so what do you know?
So there you go. Got to watch it again.
What are you going to do? So what's your location? What's your local locale?
It's interesting because I didn't. You brought up the spaghetti factory, and that's something I had already thought about a little bit. Mainly because there was that one location which was underneath the overpass. It was like venturing into a different city whenever we would go to eat there. There was a nightclub there later on in the 90s called the Cadillac Club.
Actually, earlier than that, because I saw Guns N' Roses there in 1987.
I went to a lot of punk shows there. It was right next to the spaghetti factory. And that area, that warehouse, I'm putting it in air quotes, no one can see that, warehouse district of downtown Fresno.
You can say quote unquote.
Quote unquote.
This is an audio medium.
It was a fascinating area, and eating there and then going to see punk shows there in the same building. I have very fond memories of that location.
It is a weird spot, and now it's Bitwise,
Yep.
which our friend Jason Cooksey, I don't think he works at that location, but he works for Bitwise.
That's true.
And I'm glad that it's still, the building is still there. I mean, it's been overhauled completely, but the bones of it are still kind of there. And for those of you that have old spaghetti factories, you kind of know how it doesn't matter what the outside looks like, because when you get in there, it's the wood paneling. It's the usually they have a train caboose in there that you can sit in.
Recycled furniture from, antique stores and stuff like that.
Because we went to one in Portland once when we were visiting my mom's family. I'm like, it's the same fucking thing as the one in Fresno. Weird location right on the edge of downtown Fresno, which at that time was not the best place to be. Parking lot was just dirt, if I remember correctly.
Right around the corner from there, Valley Novelty.
Don't say it. Don't say it.
I'm not going to say it.
Don't say it, because that's my place today.
Okay,
You're
go
not
for
stealing
it.
my thunder this time, motherfucker. So my place, which is right around the curve, one of the few bendy streets in Fresno is Ventura Street. Right around that curve was Valley Novelty.
Yeah.
Which, again, because of that location, I didn't really go to very often. Like, you'd never think about it. I would never think about it. I know I went a handful of times, and it lasted in one form or another up until 2017. So it closed not that long ago. By that point, like you mentioned, I think we talked about it before, it was basically just a party favor, maybe costume store. But back then, they definitely had costumes, and I know they had rubber masks.
Oh, yeah.
I remember looking at those rubber masks and just going, whoa. Because you would see those in the comic book ads too, and it was
For
like,
sure.
oh, now I can see them in real life.
In its heyday, it was a really cool place to go find all that kind of novelty stuff, but then that phased out eventually, and it was just sort of like a party rental place, as you were mentioning. But they kept that Santa Claus up there on the top. You got to mention that.
Yeah, I was going to mention the funky, it's not even a blow mold. You can look up pictures of it. It's still up there.
Yeah, he's a plaster sculpted Santa Claus, kind of disturbing.
Hanging awkwardly off the top of the sign.
Exactly.
The reason I brought it up is because it ties into this whole Saturday Night Live thing in a way, because that is where I got my arrow through the head gag.
Oh, that's
Steve
cool.
Martin popularized when I just watched that Saturday Night Live episode. He threw it on while he was playing the banjo.
And probably the exact same model and design.
Yeah, because he got it from a novelty shop.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned to you also, it was kind of funny watching one of the short films on Saturday Night Live, visiting a novelty shop in New York and showing a lot of these items. Joy Buzzer, Snakes in a Can, which
Yeah.
Why it was peanut brittle, I don't know, but I had that. I don't think I got it from Valley Novelty. I think that was an order through a comic book ad.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I got the arrow through the head there, and I also got the invisible dog on a leash gag.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Which you can still buy. Go on Amazon and you can buy those, where it's this corded rope that they have applied, I don't know,
a wire.
Glue.
I think there's a wire in there. Yeah.
No, it was made stiff with a product, with glue or
that's
something.
So interesting.
And then it had the, not just a leash on the end, but like that full body harness.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you could walk around with it in front of you and make it look like you were walking an invisible dog. I don't know why that one intrigued. I mean, they probably had joy buzzers and all that shit there. Why I got those two things? Why I understand the arrow. Why I got the invisible dog leash thing, I don't know.
Oh, I bought a joy buzzer there. One of the few things that I got, joy buzzer and clown makeup.
See, I should have gotten more stuff there and visited more often.
Yeah.
It just was a weird locale, and I just think I didn't think about it enough.
Yeah, that whole area of Fresno has changed so much, but the buildings remain. I have a lot of fond memories of just that particular 1 block radius.
And I don't think we really ventured past that curve.
Right.
Until I was old, in my late teens, early 20s and stuff, and going to the shows there at Cadillac Club, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was this little sketchy, weird edge of downtown area.
Love it. I'm glad that the building remains. I'm glad that Bitwise kept the building, but I am a little bit sad that to go to Spaghetti Factory now, you got to go a little bit more north of Fresno area, Clovis area.
It's right by my office, actually.
Oh yeah, it's right by your office, right by Fresno State.
Yeah, right by your office too, basically.
That's right. We should have lunch there sometime.
We went there a lot. My niece would pick that for her birthday dinner for quite a few years, and I haven't been in a long time. I gotta say, I love their spaghetti and meatballs.
Just the basics.
I'm serious, man.
Hey, man, are you all right?
Just mussed my hair.
I would like to feed your fingertips. To feed your fingertips. To the Wolverines.
To the Wolverines.
So you pick up any pop culture items?
Yes and no. Yes, because no items of real significance unless I talk about all of them. So I won't do that. I'll generalize it. But yes, there have been a few. The notable thing that relates back to what we talked about today was that there's a new version of a character called Too Bad that was always one of my favorites. He was recently re-released, or a new version was released, and it's amazing. It's the Masterverse Too Bad, and it's one of my favorite things I've gotten all year. I already know what you're going to say, so whatever I just said right now carries no weight compared to what you're going to say.
What do you think I'm going to say?
I have an idea. I'm not going to give it away, though.
The 2 Saturday Night Live books, the Big Coffee Table book, which I'm currently reading through. I'm actually reading, this is me. This explains a lot about me. You can download that stuff off the Internet Archive if it's something that you check out for 14 days. It has to be converted into a PDF, so I had my friend Mike White from the projection booth and from the Files of Police Squad convert it into a PDF for me. So I'm actually reading the PDF version because I don't want to break the spine on the one I bought because it's actually in very good shape. So that explains my brain, along with the Mr. Bill book, which will be playing out the episode for those of you listening right now. You get to hear the whole 4 minutes of the book as it was read on the little flexi disc that it came with. I've already mentioned my Mr. Bill plush that I had my mom make with non-canonical green pants, but still. I think I attempted to make him with modeling clay. I was convinced that he wasn't made out of Play-Doh, but I think it was just Play-Doh. Might have been modeling clay, but anyway, failed attempts, and then finally my mom made the plush for me. You got me the Luke Skywalker prototype. Target exclusive figure. I got a 4-pack of Switchblade combs.
Yeah, that's what I knew you were going to say. And I love that you got that, you found that, because that's something that one of my first purchases from a comic book was that.
And I remember eyeballing it. Yeah. I was fascinated with Switchblades as a kid.
Such a cool thing.
Do you remember that comic? And it turned in, I think it was a movie too, called The Cross and the Switchblade.
No,
it's like
I don't.
a true story. It's a Christian thing. A lot of kids growing up that way knew about it.
Yeah, I didn't know that one.
So I think that ended up turning me on to Switchblades.
That's so funny. Not crosses?
No. I'm finding this thing very therapeutic. If I'm stressing out, I come in here and I flip it a couple times, and I feel better.
Anything that can work for that. And this way, now you and I don't really have a lot of hair on the top, but I have a beard, and I'm very anxious to get my
I gotta get it to you,
so I can start using the switch action as a stress relief, but then also the repetitive combing of the beard.
I mean, it's actually perfect for a beard because it's got very short teeth.
That's right.
If I still had mine, that's what I would be using it for sure.
Now's a reason to grow a beard back.
No, too itchy. So that's a lot of fun, and
that's cool stuff.
Definitely worth it, folks. You can buy a 4-pack on Amazon for $8.
That's
amazing. I think they have even bigger packs. Buy it in bulk and give them to your friends.
Start a greaser gang.
I'll get yours to you somehow.
We gotta reconnect sometime soon, anyways, in person, just to hang out.
Yes, it's been have another art show, and I'll pop by again.
All right.
So do it just for that reason, so you can get your
Yes, I'll do that for you. I'll do it for you.
Thanks so much for listening, everybody. You've kind of already mentioned the Skelevator YouTube channel.
For sure.
I'll mention Wake Up Heavy Recollections of Horror again from the files of Police Squad.
Yes.
Both of which can be found on weirdingwaymedia.com or at wakeupheavy.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
That's right.
So, anything else before we say goodbye, Ronnie?
No, this has been a lot of fun. I like being able to dig deep. I liked hearing what you had gathered in your experiences with SNL and Not Ready for Primetime Players. It's been fun.
Which I now understand.
Yeah, exactly.
Primetime is there? Yeah. That confused me for the longest time.
It is all about educating ourselves or re-educating ourselves, right?
I enjoyed hearing all that stuff because I haven't really heard it before. Yeah. I know you like Masters of the Universe, but why?
Yeah.
So now everybody knows. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks to Ronnie for joining me as always. Listen to this amazing Mr. Bill book on the way out.
Oh, yeah. Bye.
Hey, kids, it's time for the Mr. Bill Show.
Oh, kiddies, hey, oh, boy, we're going to have fun today because we're all going to look at my family album. Yay!
Whoops.
Oh, Spot.
Say, Mr. Bill, here's your family album.
Oh, well, Mr. Hands, can we find out where I came from, huh?
Sure, Mr. Bill. You know, you're from a show business family. Your grandfather was Vaudeville Bill, and he worked hard, hoping one day to become a big star. And before long, Mr. Bill, he became so good, he brought the house down every night.
Oh, poor Grandpa.
And you know, Mr. Bill, your father was also in show business and started out in the movies as a stuntman. But your father found being a star even more hazardous than being a stuntman. So he quit show business to settle down and raise a family. And he took your mother's hand in marriage, and like your grandpa, he brought the church down. Say, and before you know it, along came little Billy.
Oh, that's me, yay!
Your mom and dad were out in the backyard picnicking that day, when all of a sudden, the glorious event happened. And as it often happened in those days, your father died during childbirth.
Oh, what a rotten way to come into the world!
And then, Mr. Bill, you received the slap of life. Then, Mr. Bill, that very evening, during a terrible rainstorm, another glorious event occurred, when a shivering little stray dog scratched on the door, and we took Spot in to stay forever.
Here comes Mr. Bill.
Oh, hey, Spot, hey! But you know, Mr. Hands, it seemed like I remember we didn't have any towels to dry him off.
Oh, I took care of that.
Oh, poor Spot, oh!
Say, and talking about drying off, do you remember your first diaper? And how I helped out when your mom didn't have any safety pins?
Oh, yeah, how can I forget that?
Oh, and you know, it was also the time you spoke your first word. Soon your mom had to go out shopping, so you got your first babysitter, Auntie Sluggo.
Oh, she wasn't a babysitter. She was just mean to me.
But Mr. Bill, she ironed your clothes for you. And she fed you. And then she brushed your teeth.
But I didn't have any teeth.
Well, Mr. Bill, it wasn't long before you were up and on your feet and ready to take your first step.
Yeah, but why did you make me take it into traffic, huh?
And soon your hair got too long, and you got your first haircut.
Oh, Mr. Hands, you know, I really had a rough childhood. I'm surprised I made it to my first birthday.
Well, Mr. Bill, as we all know, things get worse. Like when you had to go to the doctor for your first checkup. First, he checked your reflexes.
But I didn't have any reflexes.
And then he took your temperature. Well, Mr. Bill, at least your blood pressure was normal.
Yeah, but the worst thing that happened was when he gave me the vaccination for all the kids in town.
But, Mr. Bill, you've never gotten polio. Now, come on, Mr. Bill. Things weren't that bad. Like, remember what a charge you got out of Christmas?
Yeah, but why did I always have to help to light up the Christmas tree, huh?
But, Mr. Bill, remember all the fun you had at the playground? Like when you played buried treasure with your pals.
Oh, there wasn't any treasure down there.
And remember the seesaw? And how about all the great thrills when you played catcher in the Little League?
Yeah, but why did you play me so close to the plate, huh?
Well, Mr. Bill, you've finally become a young man. And remember your first day at school?
Yeah, I remember. And you know something, Mr. Hands? I'm beginning to think that maybe you haven't been such a good friend to the family like you say you are. And you know, if I see one more time you helped us out, I might get really mad.
Oh, well, I'd better shut the family album then. Oh, now you're in the family album, Mr. Bill. Bye-bye.